Hi everyone.
Hello.
We are continuing in Ray Franz's book In Search of Christian Freedom in the chapter Argumentation and Manipulation on page 441. The subheading is Bending Scripture to Fit Organizational History. The fallacy of provincialism is particularly evident in the organizations depicting itself as the central figure of various Bible prophecies. As but one example, the Watchtower publications' constant reference to events of 1919 and 1922, the time when the wrongly based Millions campaign and its focus on 1925 was in full swing, shows how by carefully developing certain features and incidents while ignoring others, events of a comparatively trivial nature occurring in a certain period of the past can be magnified to appear as of monumental significance, of world-shaking importance.
The book of Revelation, chapters 8 and 9, depicts the blowing of 7 trumpets by God's angels, accompanied by dramatic destructive effects. And later, chapters 15 and 16, we find a vision of 7 plagues and 7 bowls of God's anger due to be poured out upon the earth. The striking effects of all these are presented as of earth-shaking consequence. According to the Watchtower publications, these visions have been virtually fulfilled. How? Most notably by 7 resolutions passed at 7 conventions of Watchtower adherents during the years 1922 to 1928. Yet today, none of those organizational pronouncements and events of the 1920s are known by the vast majority of Jehovah's Witnesses, much less by anyone in the rest of the world. I seriously doubt that any member of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, aside from the author of 2 of the books setting out this interpretation, Franz, would even attempt to explain in any detail the interpretation of the pouring out of these bowls and plagues and their supposed individual fulfillments. If someone were to question them about the fulfillment, they could answer only by reading it directly from a Watchtower publication setting out the claimed interpretation.
Prophecies in the book of Daniel receive similar application. Daniel chapter 8 verses 13 and 14 speaks of a transgression causing desolation that affects God's holy place or sanctuary, and goes on to say, quote, until 2,300 evenings and mornings, and the holy place will certainly be brought into its right condition. End of quote. The book, Your Will Be Done on Earth, states that this period began in on May 25th of 1926 and ended on October 15, 1932. What happened on those dates? The first, in 1926, marked the start of a Watchtower convention held in London, England, at which a resolution was adopted, condemning the League of Nations. Only one newspaper, the London Daily News, gave any coverage of the event. The book says that the other London newspapers hushed up the biggest, most important news of the times.
End of quote.
Good grief.
Thus, the writer of the book manages to convert this simple lack of interest into something having an almost conspiratorial air. The ending date, October 15, 1932, is supposedly validated because a Watchtower magazine bearing that date called for the elimination of elective elders in all congregations. Actually, it resulted not only in ending the congregational electing of elders, but in the complete elimination of elder bodies, these being restored only some 40 years later in the 1970s. This elimination of elder bodies opened the way for the centralizing of all administrative authority in the Brooklyn headquarters. The application of Bible prophecy to events that in many cases are essentially petty truly manifests a vivid imagination, but not discretion or faithful adherence to Scripture. It's a clear example of the fallacy of provincialism. The later rejection of so many of such claimed fulfillments of prophecy demonstrates this to be so.
Yeah. It's like reading the finished mystery again. Makes you laugh.
So, what does Christendom do with these very chapters?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. That about the trumpets and the blowing of horns and
Yeah.
plagues and bowls and.
Well, for hundreds of years, the majority of books written about Revelation, Bible commentaries, were taking the historical approach. But the historical approach involved things like, let's say, the abomination of desolation, the transgression causing desolation here. A lot of expositors of Revelation and Daniel would say that that had to do with the Muslims taking over the Middle East and especially conquering Jerusalem and putting up that Dome of the Rock where the temple used to be. So, okay, you can kind of see why people would go that direction. And then the four horsemen of the apocalypse were the tremendous judgments that came upon not only Christendom but upon all the Europe during those years of the Middle Ages, etc.
So even though they proved to be wrong, at least they were earth-shattering events. They were events that affected the whole world. I'm not excusing it, but you can see how a person can get swept up by that kind of
this historical
event, any
this
kind of
historical
tragedy.
interpretation.
Yeah.
So then the seven trumpets would be the Reformation, the great movements of the Reformation, and the vials, the last judgments. Well, they were still in the future. So they had a long view of the fulfillment of Revelation, going from the first century onwards. But that was all scrapped around the time that Russell was a young man. This historical approach to Revelation was discredited by modern events, and especially one, namely the restoration of Israel to its homeland. That happened, of course, while Russell was still preaching this. Now, Russell was the inheritor of this approach, this historical approach to Revelation. He inherited it, and actually, in the early books, even of Rutherford, you still got this idea that the seven churches of Revelation are the seven ages of the church. So that kind of draws out the prophetic picture
And
over
they
the whole
did believe
2,000
that
years.
at one time, right? Because they thought they were the Laodicean.
Not
age.
they, him.
Well, yeah,
The Laodicean messenger.
was Russell.
So they abandoned that historical view of Revelation early in the Rutherford era, and it was all gone by about 1931, when, of course, Rutherford discovered that the Jews had nothing to do with any of this.
Now they have to change this working out because they brought the elders back, right? The elder system back. So that can't be the last date. So we can look forward to a new interpretation in later books, right?
Yeah, I think we should do a little detour into a later interpretation, specifically of this 2300 days. Here it's from 1926 to 1932. But in modern literature about that very passage, they have moved it. And that move in itself is revealing as to the real motivation and mechanism that the Watchtower uses to unfold any prophecy. Since it always has to do with them, we can kind of guess what they're going to do with it.
I was thinking too while reading this, because you will get individuals that will kind of get carried away with any kind of major event in the world, and try and apply it to Scripture and to these kinds of passages. I think as ex-witnesses, because we've gone through this story several times, it should be a kind of warning, or at least it should be something that will prevent us from sliding back into excitement over, things happening in the world and trying to apply them. I think the better study would be to study prophecy that has been fulfilled in Scripture, because that at least builds you up and gives you confidence in God. But when you start being subjective about what things mean because of things happening in the world at your time, you're likely to get swept up into another danger spot and be misled.
Yeah. So Ray is warning us against subjectivism, making it about us. called provincialism here in this discussion of argumentation, but is also warning us against dogmatism. And we've got a couple of videos that we're going to link here on the Watchtower's dogmatism in that era, just around the time Russell died, in its interpretation of the finished mystery, but also one we've done on the book of Daniel and the 2300 days. So they're on your screen right now, and next time we'll take a detour into later interpretations of this Daniel 8 passage on the 2300 days until the holy place is brought into its right condition.
Mm-hmm.